On Friday the 21st of July, just last year, a 43-year-old man named Kelvin Moore was found dead in his prison cell after an apparent drug overdose. However, upon receiving his remains, the family mortician would reveal that somebody had stolen his organs. The prison would later declare that they were removed as part of the standard procedure for any autopsy, but rather than returning them to the body afterwards, they had instead decided to keep the organs, despite not receiving any kind of approval from the family beforehand. So, mortified by this discovery, Kelvin's brother immediately set off to the hospital and demanded that they return the organs at once, to which they would begrudgingly agree, before handing him a red biohazard bag and sending him on his way. But after burying the body the very next day, it was later revealed that this was not an isolated incident, as over the following weeks, several other families would begin to come forward, complaining of the same treatment, eventually resulting in a class action lawsuit. However, to this day, these families are still seeking reparations for their suffering, and due to the dark nature of the crime, many have started to wonder, why are so many organs being stolen? And could the prison systems in America be somehow connected to the black market trade of organ harvesting? Kelvin Lamar Moore was born on the 29th of December in 1979 to his loving mother and father, Agolia and Johnny Moore, in the town of Pritchard, Alabama, alongside his 9 siblings, of which he was the youngest. Not too much is known about his childhood, but according to the family, Kelvin was the apple of their eye, and was always viewed as the baby due to the fact that he was nearly a decade younger than his closest sibling. The Moore family were also heavily involved in their Christian faith, as well as the music ministry, with Kelvin opting to play the drums in the church. And as a teen, he attended McGill-Toolen Catholic High School in the town of Mobile, of which he would eventually drop out early, deciding to get a GED diploma at a community college instead. However, as Kelvin moved into his 20s, it was clear that he had established himself within a group of friends that did not have his best interests at heart. And so it wasn't long before he would begin adopting a list of destructive traits, most notably his addiction to illegal substances, which would be the start of his downfall. According to his brother Simone, Kelvin had started hanging with the wrong crowd, and soon after was getting in trouble with the law. So unfortunately, it seemed to have only been a matter of time before Kelvin would end up behind bars, which is indeed what happened in 1999, when Kelvin was convicted of 2 counts of attempted murder, and 1 count each of burglary, assault and kidnapping, resulting in a 99-year prison sentence. Now, although this behaviour was certainly deserving of a lengthy prison sentence, it was clear to everyone during his trial, including the judge, that drug use was at the root of his issues, and therefore, explicit instructions were passed on to the prison system to treat Kelvin's addiction, a request that would seem to have fallen on deaf ears. Instead, Kelvin was sent to one of Alabama's most notorious security lockups, which was later described as a third world death trap by inmates and activists alike, and he would then cycle through different prison institutions throughout the next 23 years, each one just as brutal as the last. However, he would eventually find a small slice of happiness when he was moved to the William C. Holman Correctional Facility, which was located about an hour north of his family's home in Pritchard, making it convenient for his mother and siblings to visit him regularly. At Holman, his mother Agla would go on to say that her son eventually earned the right to live in the honor dorm as a result of his good behaviour. He received several certificates for taking whatever classes that were offered, and he also mentored other inmates who were seeking their GED certificates. However, all of this progress and hard work would seem to eventually come crashing down when Kelvin was suddenly forced to move prisons once again, this time ending up at Donaldson Correctional Facility in Jefferson County, which was located 4 hours away from his family, and as a result, his mother Agla Moore couldn't travel to see him regularly anymore, and was given no choice but to settle for simply talking to her son by phone as much as possible. But despite her attempts to keep a close relationship with her youngest child, Kelvin would gradually begin to miss their phone calls from time to time, and his family started to see a change in his behaviour whenever they did manage to travel up to see him. It was clear that drugs were once again part of his life since moving to the new prison, which, to be honest, was no surprise due to the fact that the Donaldson Correctional Facility was made famous for its barbaric conditions, where substance abuse was almost a necessity to get through the day. However, the situation was made even worse when Kelvin was once again moved to another correctional facility in the town of Harvest, which was a further 2 hours away from his family. And it would seem that this constant uprooting would begin to take its toll, as by now, Kelvin had developed a nasty addiction to fentanyl. Similar to the previous prison, the Limestone Correctional Facility was also notorious for its dangerous environment, but despite knowing what they knew about the prison, Kelvin's family could have never anticipated what would happen next on that fateful day in July. On Friday the 21st of July, Kelvin would call his mother from the prison at approximately 6 p.m, and the two shared a regular conversation with nothing seeming to be out of the ordinary. But around 90 minutes after that phone call ended, Aguilar would receive another phone call from the prison, but this time it was from the Limestone prison minister, who had some extremely troubling news. According to the authorities, Kelvin had been found unconscious in his cell, and after rushing him to the medical professionals, he was unfortunately pronounced dead at the scene. His body was then sent over to the University of Alabama in Birmingham to conduct an autopsy to better understand the cause of death. So after removing his organs and running the necessary tests, the morticians discovered that Kelvin had more than likely died of a fentanyl overdose, which was relatively common for the Limestone Correctional Facility. However, rather than returning the organs back to Kelvin's body, the morticians instead packaged them up separately before transferring what was left of the body over to Kelvin's family in Pritchard, assuming that they would simply bury their loved one and move on. But given their close relationship with a funeral director in the area, Aguilar Moore was determined to conduct her own post-mortem examination to make sure her son received a proper burial. So, after asking the mortician to embalm the body, this was when they discovered that all of Kelvin's internal organs had been removed, which understandably caused the family to start asking questions. After all, they had not given their consent for the prison to hold on to Kelvin's organs, and for all they knew, the prison could have been hiding something about the way he had died. So, furious with the situation, Kelvin's brother Simone then called up the university demanding the return of Kelvin's organs, but to his surprise, he was met with confusion when the prison minister would call up the family once again to ask why they wanted the organs. But remaining persistent, Kelvin's family continued to ask, even after being told that the university was technically allowed to hold on to them. And eventually the authorities caved and offered to return the organs as long as the family could pick them up themselves. However, despite receiving such an egregious request from the institution, Kelvin's family were determined to get to the bottom of the situation. So the very next day, they would do the 4-hour drive all the way up from Pritchard to the university hospital to collect the organs and express their disgust in person. But upon arrival, despite the turmoil they had been put through in the previous days, they could have never expected what would happen next. On Friday the 28th of July, Simone Moore, alongside his sister Monica Kaiser, travelled over to the University of Alabama to retrieve their loved one's missing organs. However, upon arrival, rather than being greeted with an apology and a detailed explanation, they were instead gifted with a red biohazard bag and sent on their way, at which point Simone would decide to pose for a picture outside the hospital as a means of documenting the despicable handling of his brother's remains. But not wanting to drag out the heartbreaking process for much longer, the family then returned home and opted to bury Kelvin's body alongside the bag of organs, as they could not bring themselves to open it. And the next day, the funeral service was held, with Kelvin's body finally being put to rest. However, after a few months had passed, Aguilar Moore would unfortunately lose her husband, Johnny, which would cause the entire family to have to go through the difficult grieving process all over again. But on his deathbed, Johnny would declare that he had one last wish, before instructing his wife to not let their son's death go without some kind of fight. So, determined to make her late husband proud, Aguilar then decided to turn up the heat and began contacting as many lawyers as she could in a desperate attempt to get justice. However, despite the enormous efforts of everybody involved. To this day, we still do not know what truly happened to Kelvin Moore, and without the support of the public, his family fears that they may never get the closure that they so desperately deserve. Now, unfortunately, as far as the official investigation goes, this is all we know for now. But in the months since his death, numerous media outlets have covered the story, and the Moore family have been able to amass an enormous amount of support from a team of lawyers who are working tirelessly to uncover the truth. Kelvin's case has also now been grouped in with several other cases of organ harvesting, all of which consist of prisoners dying under suspicious circumstances before their bodies are stripped for parts and sold to the highest bidder. So despite the dark nature of this case, there may be light at the end of the tunnel after all, as Kelvin's story has certainly helped bring this gross misconduct to the surface, and therefore, hopefully it will only be a matter of time before the truth is finally revealed. However, until that day comes, all we can do is continue to share their stories and speculate as to what may have happened. So with that, let's get into some of the potential theories. Now, just before I get into the darker theories, I wanted to start this portion of the video by giving these institutions the benefit of the doubt, as the fact is there is a shortage of organs in the United States for transplants, science and medical education, so it's relatively common for some universities to buy body parts and organ specimens so students can dissect them for training purposes. However, another fact which I feel should also be mentioned is that research has shown black families in the state of Alabama to be much more susceptible to being victimized in this way, because statistics show that 56% of the 21,000 inmate population is black, even though they only account for about 27% of the state's population. Also, many of the state's prison facilities are more than 100% over capacity, meaning that hundreds of autopsies have been undertaken over the years on black inmates without any kind of family consent. Now, in July of 2021, around 2 years before Kelvin passed away, a bill was signed to prevent forensic personnel from retaining organs after autopsies without permission from next of kin. But that doesn't seem to have stopped the universities from doing so, as the autopsy consent forms are usually just signed by the prison wardens themselves. But taking a step away from how these crimes have been committed, another very important question to ask is why? Well, medical students do need something to practice on, and so the organs of prison inmates do provide somewhat of a charitable service to help the students learn and perform better in their roles going forward. But surely this cannot be the only reason. After all, freshly dissected organs can be incredibly lucrative given their scarcity and useful functions, so to use them for dissection practices seems like a huge waste of opportunity, where they could instead be used to save lives. Now, it's true that organs have a very short lifespan, so they can only be used in a transplant operation if they are incredibly fresh. Therefore, I can see how there may be a large quantity of organs lying around that aren't of any particular use. But if this was the case when it came to Kelvin or any of the other victims, why weren't the hospitals more upfront about their plans with the families? You could argue that this behaviour makes them look extremely guilty, so you can certainly see why many have started to question whether the prisons could be hiding a darker truth. After all, how do we know for sure Kelvin did die as a result of an overdose to fentanyl? The family mortician could never conduct the second autopsy because the organs were already removed and tampered with, so it's impossible to say. But one thing that is for sure is that the state of Alabama has a huge problem on its hands, as these families will not go down without a fight. So with this in mind, I think it will only be a matter of time before the truth is finally revealed and justice will be served once and for all. Now, just before I end the video, I wanted to quickly give my personal opinion on the situation, as I know it's easy to say that these inmates deserve to be mistreated due to their behaviour, but I believe there is so much more to the story that cannot go unnoticed. We have to keep in mind that a lot of these prison inmates are only there as a result of an incredibly difficult upbringing, so I feel to write them all off as lost causes and do whatever you want with them is somewhat inhumane. I know Kelvin Moore was in prison for a reason, but it seems clear to me that his actions that day were more than likely the result of funding his drug habit, as the attempted murder came off the back of a burglary, which was probably the only way he knew how to make money fast in order to pay for his fix. Now, this certainly doesn't excuse his behaviour, and I do believe he should have been given a prison sentence for his actions. But what I will say is that it would seem the prison was never intending to rehabilitate him like the judge had asked for during his trial. In fact, it appears to me that the prison inmates of Alabama's correctional facilities are treated more like animals, and the prison wardens almost act like deranged farmers, sending the inmates wherever they want, getting them addicted to drugs inside a facility that should be closed off to the outside world, and then when they pass away, selling their body parts for money. This may sound like an exaggeration, but from how Kelvin's family described him, it would seem that he was truly turning his life around in prison against all odds. So to move him away from a life where he was flourishing and sending him to a third world death trap doesn't seem like the prison wardens had his best interests at heart. To me, it seems that these inmates are looked at as nothing more than commodities, who are unfortunately worth a lot more to the prisons dead than they are alive. So it would not be a surprise if we found out that all of these prison wardens were corrupt in some way. Now, you are of course entitled to your own opinion here, and I can certainly see why you may feel no sympathy for Kelvin Moore. But just before you completely write him off, remember that these inmates are human beings with families who love them. So until we start treating them as such, I fear rehabilitation will never be possible. Anyway, on that note, I think I'll leave this video here. But if you have any opinions of your own in relation to what happened to Kelvin Moore, please leave your comments down below and I'll do my best to get back to you. But until then, thank you so much for watching, and make sure to subscribe to the channel for updates on these cases. Also, if you found this story interesting, feel free to check out the video on screen now, which covers the case of Dexter Wade, another man of colour whose death was severely mishandled by the authorities when he was buried in an unmarked grave after being run down by an off-duty police officer.